If we have died with him, we will also live with him. If we endure, we will also reign with him. If we deny him, he will also deny us. If we disbelieve, he still believes, for he cannot deny himself. That is actually a hymn from the first generation church. When Paul writes it down in his letter to Timothy, he's writing it down as if he were quoting a hymn. As if I were writing a letter to you, and I said, in the middle of the letter, and I said, and don't forget these words, amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. He's quoting a hymn that was sung. Where did the words come from? They came from, in most of the instances, Thomas. The most maligned and misunderstood of the 12 apostles, because he's been stuck for 1,000 years with the moniker Doubting Thomas. I'm going to try to show you this morning that Thomas, if you were really going to call him anything, you would call him the warrior twin. He's a twin. We don't know who his twin was. It could have been an identical brother. It could have been a fraternal brother. It could have been a sister. But we know he was a twin because the word Thomas means twin. Thomas might not have been Thomas's real name any more than Peter was Simon Bar-Jonah's real name. Might have been a street name. But we only know him as the twin, as Thomas. But he had the spirit of a warrior. And we see this in his words and in his actions. Thomas speaks 4 times in the Bible. They're all in the Gospel of John. The first time was in the gospel lesson that we heard 3 weeks ago that was read again in the Palm Sunday service, beginning just a few weeks before the end of Jesus' life. Jesus had been in Jerusalem for Hanukkah, and there he had declared himself to be the light of the world, and he had declared his divinity. And as a result, people wanted to stone him, because if you call yourself God, that's blasphemy. Unless, of course, you are. But it wasn't Jesus' time to die. So he leaves with the disciples, and they go back up to Galilee. And while they're up in Galilee, Jesus gets word that Lazarus is sick. And so Jesus, he doesn't snap his fingers and heal him from afar as he did the centurion's servant. He doesn't go running back to Judea to heal his friend while there's still time, the way he did for Peter's mother. No. He sits there and does nothing for 2 days. And then he turns to his disciples and says, let's go to Judea. Well, the disciples realize that Jesus going to Judea is essentially signing his death warrant. That there are enough people out there who are out to get him. And so, in the gospel lesson 3 weeks ago, if you remember, there was a back and forth between the disciples. And finally, Jesus comes right out and says, I'm going to Judea. We're going to raise Lazarus from the dead, and it will glorify God. And then for the first time, we hear Thomas, who turns to his other disciples and says, let us also go, that we may die with him. Now, there are 2 ways of taking that. One is that he's being snarky. Well, let's also go. We'll die with him. Yeah. But that's probably not how he meant it. He probably meant it seriously. The first thing in the spirit of the warrior is that you have to expect to die. if you go into battle trying to save your life, you're going to lose the battle. You go into battle expecting to die. Notice I didn't say expect to lose. But you have to expect to die. Thomas's commanding officer is going into the teeth of the enemy. And he is willing to die. And if he's willing to die, then Thomas is willing to go with him and die with him. And so they go to Judea, as we read in the lessons in Palm Sunday. Lazarus is raised from the dead. The Palm Sunday excursion into Jerusalem occurs in large part because of the people who are proclaiming Jesus is the Messiah because he raised Lazarus from the dead. But Jesus knows better. He knows the crowd will turn on him. And he loves them and us enough to go through with it all. And the night before he dies, he meets with the disciples one more time at the Passover supper. And he tries one more time to explain to them what's going to happen. And at one point, he says to the disciples, you know where I'm going, and you know the way. And they should have, because he had told them 100 times before. But they didn't. And it's like, I know what it's like as a professor to stand in front of a class and to teach something for the 100th time and have a class of 12 and 11 of them are going because they have no idea what's going on. And then there's the 12th one who raises his hand. And that's what Thomas does. He turns to Jesus and says, Master, we don't know where you're going. How can we know the way? And again, you could take that as being snarky. Well, we don't know where you're going. Yeah. But I don't think that's what he means. I think he means it seriously. He's the warrior. The warrior needs his orders to know where to go in the battle. I'm supposed to be following you, Jesus. I don't know where you're going. I need to know the way. And that's when Jesus turns to Thomas and he says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No man comes to the Father but by me. And in saying that, he has given Thomas his marching orders. I, Jesus, am going to the Father. If you want to follow me, that's where you're going to end up. And you're going to have to do it through me, because there's no other way. And we can see in Thomas's life that he does this. Jesus is indeed captured, tried, condemned to death, crucified, dies, and was buried, as we recite in the Apostles' Creed. And then Sunday morning comes. The women go to the tomb because the burial procedure hadn't been completed. They get to the tomb. The stone is rolled away. The tomb is empty. The grave clothes are there, but Jesus is not there. And they start looking around to try to figure out what happened. Mary Magdalene sees a gardener, or at least she thinks he's a gardener. Maybe he knows. We have a missing person here. Maybe I can get some testimony. And so she goes to the gardener. And after a back and forth, the gardener says, Mary. And Mary Magdalene realizes it's Jesus. And Jesus gives her an order. Go to the disciples. Tell them I've risen, and I will meet them in Galilee. And so Mary Magdalene, she goes running to where the disciples are, locked in an upper room, scared to death. And she tells them, the tomb is empty. Jesus is risen. I've seen him, and he's told me to tell you to go to Galilee. And of the 12 disciples, how many believe her? The answer is none. Not one. Every one of them is a doubting disciple. But we don't talk about doubting Peter, or doubting John, or doubting James, or doubting Nathaniel, or doubting Philip, or doubting Simon the Zealot. They were all doubters. And one of the proofs is found at the very beginning of today's gospel lesson. If they had believed, they wouldn't have been still locked in the upper room. They would have been on their way to Galilee. Because Jesus is risen. He's given a message to Mary to tell us, meet him in Galilee. But they don't go. Because they're afraid of dying. The warrior expects to die. And we see a clue to this again. Who's not locked in the upper room on the evening of Easter? The answer is Thomas. He's out. Where is he? Don't know. Don't know what he was doing. The Bible doesn't tell us. But even if he'd gone to a convenience store to get a Coke, which would have been pretty hard, because Coke wasn't invented for 1900 years. But even if he's going to the convenience store to get a Coke, the point is, he's the only disciple who isn't afraid to die. All he knows is that Jesus is dead and he's next. But he's also been told by his master that the only way to the Father is through him. And the only way he can understand that is that if Jesus has died, I have to die also. And so if they capture me, I'm no better than my master. And that's why he's out, not locked. He's not fraidy cat Thomas. He's the warrior twin. Well, sure enough, Jesus shows up while Thomas is gone. Why does Jesus show up? Because they didn't get their marching orders right. They were supposed to be halfway to Galilee. And we understand this because what does Jesus say? He comes and he says, hello. Well, he says, Shalom Aleichem. Peace be with you. And then he lets them touch his hands and his feet and his side. And they believe now because they have touched his hands and feet and side. And no one ever calls them doubters. And then he says, as the Father sent me, so send I you. There's a hint behind that. There's an unspoken message. Yo! Dude! I told you! Galilee! And so Jesus leaves. And Thomas comes back. And of course, the disciples are all sounding like, well, they're all sounding like Mary Magdalene. We've seen Jesus! We've seen... Thomas is a warrior. The warrior is a realist. He can't live in a fantasy world. He has to see the battlefield as it is. He has to see the enemy as it is. He has to see the casualty list as it is. He saw Jesus die. He hasn't seen Jesus alive. And these guys, they were so scared they wouldn't go outside with me. And I'm supposed to believe them now? Unless I see what you saw. the nail prints in his hands and in his feet and the sword in his side. Unless I see what you saw, I won't believe. Which makes Thomas no different than any of the other disciples. A week goes by. Why hasn't Thomas gone to Galilee? Well, Jesus isn't really his commanding officer anymore. Peter is. Peter is the head of the disciples. And Peter isn't going anywhere. The warrior doesn't go AWOL. The warrior sticks with his commanding officer, even when the officer is wrong. The disciples didn't go to Galilee the way they were supposed to. They were still scared. And this time Thomas stays when Jesus shows up. Jesus shows up, he says, Shalom Aleichem. Peace be with you. Hello. And then he immediately goes to Thomas. Yo, Thomas, look. Hands, feet, side. Don't disbelieve. Believe. Thomas doesn't have to touch Jesus' hands and feet. He doesn't have to put his hand in his side. He knows. And he proclaims what none of the other disciples had proclaimed, including Peter. He proclaims, my Lord and my God. And then Jesus says something that isn't really for Thomas's benefit, and it isn't for the benefit of the other disciples. He says, do you believe me because you've seen? Blessed are those who do not see and yet believe. He's not saying that for Thomas's sake. He's not saying that for the other disciples' sake, because they didn't believe either until they saw. They doubted just as much as he did. He's saying it for you, for me. He's saying it because we have to not see and yet believe. And that's the last we hear about Thomas in the Bible. But that isn't the last of Thomas. The reason we don't hear about Thomas in the Bible is because the story of the first generation church, as told in the Bible, is the story of what happens in Europe, what happens in Asia Minor, what happens in Greece, what happens in Italy and in Rome. But that isn't the only place the gospel went. We know that Philip preached the gospel to the Ethiopian eunuch, who took it to Africa. And there have been Christians in Ethiopia for the last 2,000 years because of that. We know that the gospel went on the Silk Road to China, at the very least, and historians took it there. And there have been Christians in China. We know that Irish monks took the gospel to West Virginia because their runes are on the cave walls there. Long before Columbus or anyone else showed up. What about the Middle East? What about India? The gospel went there too. And it was taken there by Thomas. You have to remember, in this era, Judea is part of the Roman Empire. They may not have liked it. They may not have liked being aliens in a Roman Empire. But they were part of the empire. The Middle East was part of what was called the Parthian Empire, which was the new name for the Persians and the Babylonians. And they were the enemies of the Roman Empire. So when Thomas goes in the opposite direction, he is walking into the teeth of the enemy, just as Jesus did. No one comes to the Father except through me. Thomas goes into Babylon and preaches the gospel and begins a church that is still there. And he goes into Persia, which is today Iran, and he preaches the gospel and he begins a church which is still there under much greater persecution than ever happened in the Roman Empire. And then he hops a ship and he goes to India. He goes to the west coast of India and he preaches the gospel and he begins a church that is still there. And then he goes around the peninsula to the east coast of India and he preaches the gospel and he begins a church which is still there. And there he dies. And he dies a martyr's death. He's killed by Hindus who are afraid of the gospel, just the way the Romans and the Greeks and the Jewish leaders were all afraid of the gospel, because it preached peace and salvation and liberty for all of the captives. Just as Moses, when he was told in the Old Testament lesson, you must go and tell them. And he says, they won't believe me. They need to see you. Blessed are those who have not seen and yet believed. And that hymn? If we have died with him, we will also live with him. Remember what Thomas said, let us also go, that we may die with him. If we endure, we will also reign with him. People knew in Europe what was going on in the Middle East and in India. The word got back. People knew what Thomas was doing. And if we disbelieve, he continues to believe. Even when we don't trust, God still trusts himself. And because of that, he still believes in us. Even when we don't believe in him. Because it's not because he can't deny us. It's because he can't deny himself. And one more story. Fast forward 800 years. It's the 800s. One of the worst times in European history. The Roman Empire has long since collapsed in the West. There is a new heresy. The heresy of Islam, which has taken over the Middle East and all of North Africa, and it's taken over all of Spain and Portugal and half of France. It's beating down at the door in Eastern Europe. And in the midst of all of this trouble, out of seemingly nowhere from the north come the Vikings. And wherever the Vikings go, in Britain, in France, in Sicily, in Italy, everywhere, wherever they go, they loot and pillage, burn and rape and murder. And the Christians living in Europe in the 800s are firmly convinced that the world has to end and Jesus has to come back soon, because it's the only way that could fix this hell. Except that a strange thing happens. All right, not so strange, because it's happened before. It happened with the Vandals. It happened with the Berbers and the Magyars. It happened with the Huns. It happened with the Germans, the Angles and the Saxons, the Jutes and the Britons, the Gauls and the Goths, and the Romans and the Greeks. The Vikings accept Jesus. They become Christians. They give up their gods for the one true God. They don't stop being warriors, but they are no longer warriors for looting and pillaging, burning and raping and murdering. They are now warriors for Christ. And one of them, obviously one of the bigger ones, one of the higher up ones, in northern France, when he gets baptized, he takes on the name of the one apostle who had been willing to die with Jesus, who had gone into the teeth of the enemy for Jesus. He took on the name of Thomas. And as a result, his descendants, from then until today, are known as the descendants of Thomas. The Massey's. And yes, the name got shortened to Massey. And one of his descendants crossed the English Channel with William the Conqueror and established a baronet in a place that to this day is called Dunham Massey. He built a castle and his son built a cathedral, just like David building the castle and Solomon building the temple. And one of his descendants went to Jerusalem and died in the last crusade. Remember the words, "Let us also go to Judea, that we may die with him." And one of his descendants crossed another channel, well, bigger than a channel. He crossed the Atlantic Ocean. And in 1636, became an indentured servant in Virginia. There have been 14 generations, and every single one of them has moved from the place he was born to the place where he died. Including the 13th generation, who was born in New Jersey, went to Japan, came back to Pennsylvania, and moved to Florida. And the 14th generation has already moved to Indiana, and then Wisconsin, and then Illinois, and now Arizona. And the one thing about all of those generations, and they weren't all good people, but even the bad ones, they established a church and they brought the gospel wherever they were. That's the legacy of Thomas. Not doubting Thomas. The warrior Thomas, who fought not with a sword of steel, but with the sword of the Spirit, which is the Word of God. And that's his legacy to you. Who needs the gospel in your life? Go to them today.